My idea is an industry-specific project management system.
It's something that I'm not familiar with at all in a way, but I like the industry. It's kind of mix of hardware and software. So
my idea for the episode, it's along the same lines with kids. Approximately 2 weeks ago, I saw my niece preparing for one of these great exams to get into a certain type of school.
Yeah, the one that'll be the least relatable, I think, for any audience at this point.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 10th episode of the $1 Million Ideas podcast. Today, we have a special guest with us. Tim Grassin is on the podcast with us, who is a serial entrepreneur, has started 3 businesses, sold them, and is now based in Bangkok, where he is working on his next big thing. This is going to be interesting because all 3 of us have similar sort of like backgrounds, and we're going to be discussing 4 different ideas with you. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the podcast.
And thanks for having me, Usman and Ken. Lovely to be on a podcast for once instead of hosting it.
Which one do you think, like, hosting it is definitely harder? You got a lot more prep, I think, to do versus coming on.
Yeah, you got prep, and then you want to make sure you're delivering properly and you're keeping the guests entertained while thinking about what the audience wants to hear. So you're juggling a lot of stuff, making sure that, it just flows naturally as well.
Any favorite podcasts in the startup space that you listen to quite religiously?
I mean, I don't want to play favorites with any of my guests. So in terms of my own podcast, none. But like I've been inspired by my first million. I think that's the inspiration of my own podcast. It's given so much to me from an inspiration standpoint, ideas, just feeling part of a community of startup founders. And that's what was lacking in Southeast Asia, in my opinion. And that's why I decided to start my own called Next Big Wave. But yeah, I'd say like, I don't listen to that many podcasts. For someone who does podcasting right now for a living, my area of listening is very limited.
Right. I think everyone's sort of like moving gradually towards the shorts and just the highlights off the podcast versus listening to an hour long or 45-minute podcast, which is a shame, but I guess it's a funnel. If you're interested in the short, maybe you click on the entire clip then. How's it going, Ken?
Good to be back. Just got back from Tokyo. Yeah, it was hot, kind of. I was surprised. Like I would have wanted it to be more like real fall, but it felt more like Bangkok than I would have preferred.
All right, so let's get started. Why don't you kick us off, Ken? We'll start with you, and then Tim can go after that.
My idea is an industry-specific project management system. I was joining a call by a solar software SaaS not too long ago. So they sell this a lot to American solar companies that install solar for residential and commercial. And to me, it looked like a ClickUp or an Asana, but just much worse. Like I was looking at this piece of software. I was like, wow, it was so clunky, but there were some industry specific functions about how solar projects are managed. And that was the only thing. Otherwise, it was just a worse version of these other popular project management software. So I was just thinking to myself, there's clients that want this. They think that, okay, if I have some specific tool to manage the projects in my domain, I'm better off. And therefore they're willing to spend the money. And so companies like this actually have made a pretty good business catering to that. And I think that you could make like a dumbed down version of a ClickUp pretty quickly using, AI and whatnot, and then customize it using AI fairly quickly to help you with the coding and create these, niche specific versions of it that you then target towards those niches. So that's the idea.
I think immediately when you started talking about it, things like Vanta came to mind, which was a very specific around compliance and risk, but also like specific project management. I think in architecture and construction, there are quite a few companies in the space. But how would you do it? Would it be like building blocks? Because now I think like in this area of vertical SaaS, like everyone is trying to build for their industry. So I think it's on trend over there. But would the idea be like we would build very specific building blocks and then people can put them together whichever way they want, or how?
I'm thinking of it as what we do is very much building blocks. So we build some core building blocks, and then we have some that are specific to solar, some that are specific maybe to financial services, whatnot. But we're making it seem to the customer that it's like this seamless fintech project management software rather than just, they're plugging in a block or something. So I would want to compete against the project management that's out there that says that they're completely catering to that niche and then, go head to head. But on the back end, we did it in a very quick, simple way.
Yeah, well, what you're saying kind of reminds me back in the day, I was seeing a lot of white labeled solutions that would just basically adapt to specific industries and needs, whether it was project management or other tools. And I think you mentioned ClickUp, and I think that's a great way to sort of, instead of having to rebuild from scratch, maybe just become an agency that uses ClickUp as the foundation and then builds, industry specific or country specific sort of frameworks with professional services on top to fully customize it to the needs of the client. So you move away from building SaaS, but you become more of an agency. And I think the go-to market will be a lot quicker. Obviously, you're not looking at crazy multiples, but immediate cash flow. So as a business itself, I get it.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to start. Maybe you just stay that way, but you kind of like figure out the customer, what do they want, solve their problem as quickly and simply as you can. And then if, click up and just tailoring it a bit to the customer is enough, you just stick with that. And if there's an opportunity to do something deeper and get a better multiple or something, then yeah, you can go a bit further.
Yeah, I just recently learned about ClickUp. You mentioned it, and you mentioned how you were an expert, and now I'm working with a guy who's running my operations at Next Big Wave, and he's also a ClickUp expert, and he kind of walked me through it, and I was like, this tool is extremely powerful, but boy, it's daunting to get into. And if you're not an expert, you can forget about setting it up for your organization. I would say you need an expert, whether internally or externally, to help you set it all up. And then it becomes something that is exactly what you need, regardless of what your operations are, I think.
Yeah. I love ClickUp. So that's, it's changed my life. It's changed the way I manage. I don't even consider myself an expert feature wise. I keep my use cases relatively simple, but still, like everybody, even from what I consider relatively simple, when a new person sees it, they're like, oh my God, wow, this is so daunting. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
I like the agency approach as well, because agency approach helps you, like Tim said, like go to market, try to figure out which sector is sort of like appealing to you. Like a lot of these tools, whether that be Asana or Basecamp or any of these other tools, are so generic, and then people are always trying to fiddle with them or trying to put like different features on top of them. So if you could figure out a workflow that runs for someone, like, I don't know, insurance companies that have a certain sort of like workflow, then you can actually nail that down very specifically, go after that segment. And then if there's something there, you can actually figure out whether it's even worth it to white label it. I remember the CRMs like this sort of like happen. Like there are lots of open source CRMs that get adjusted because CRM workflows are very specific to industry as well. And if you don't want to run Salesforce in this case, then you sort of like switch that onto that.
Yeah, one thing that I was a bit shocked by, I was taking the Tokyo subway a fair bit, and two of the companies I saw quite a bit advertising was Asana and Workday, which are both, large Western SaaS companies. Asana's project management. But I was surprised that, right there on the Tokyo JR, like they're all over the place, which just shows you that there's a lot of I think there's a lot of markets that are still relatively on top tier. And I think, niche plus geography, and you just hit it, and you'll hit some pretty clear like niches.
I've been in North America for quite a while, and up to very recently, and it's probably still the case, a lot of the companies that I meet are still running off of Google Sheets or Excel. So I can only imagine what corporations in Southeast Asia look like. I mean, we're nowhere near like, saturation in terms of adoption of these products. So yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity, at least in the region.
And I think some of the larger enterprise ones are on the Microsoft stack, and they're, Microsoft, I saw some of their tools using AI and whatnot, like they've integrated the open AI stuff, and it's pretty impressive stuff. But I feel like that's pretty expensive, and there's a lot of businesses out there that they're not paying that price point, and something like this would float, work for them.
All right. Thanks, Ken. So that was an industry-specific white labeling sort of like tool, which I think that we pivoted into like an agency approach first, and then sort of like doing discovery over there. And that probably helps you if you can get into an industry to that $1 million ARR mark faster if you have the contacts in that space, and then you can take it from there. All right, moving on to idea number 2. Like, Tim, do you want to share your idea with us?
Yeah, so it's something that I'm not familiar with at all in a way, but I like the industry. It's kind of a mix of hardware and software. So if we look at mental health right now, a lot of the apps that are tackling mental health are using AI to sort of allow people to interact with it and sort of get relief from what's stressing them or whatever is causing them anxiety. And to me, like, that sector is doing well, but for the kids who are struggling with mental health, interacting with screen time can be daunting and can probably accentuate their anxiety and their stressors. And I thought, if you embedded like a trained LLM into a teddy bear or like a plush or something that they can relate to and that brings them comfort already, and they can start interacting with voice and have actions and prompts that sort of make them feel better, I think that's a really interesting industry. I don't know how big it is. I just know mental health is a huge problem in North America, probably in Europe as well. In Southeast Asia, I'm not familiar with the industry, but like just adding a layer of comfort and realism, or at least something palpable to sort of interact with, I think would be quite interesting.
Yeah, I love the idea. And also these days, I think the distribution is sort of like built into it, because if you can get these things with kids, interacting with them on TikToks and YouTube videos, the distribution is viral. Because I think, let's talk about the problem first, which is it's a growing trend. And I think it fully exists in Southeast Asia and most of Asia, but it is not acknowledged. And so a lot of people just live through this, unfortunately, without anyone having to talk to, because there is still a very large stigma attached to it. So I think, like, from that learning perspective, and like you said, the LLMs can speak multiple languages, so they can adapt to whatever language the user wants. I think the margins on these things are also very large. So I think like being 2 in 1 with something that's definitely could help anyone. Just even, I don't know, would you position it from a mental health perspective, or would you position it from here's your good
companion
friend?
Or like good friend? I think it could go either way. It can definitely just be a friend that has more sort of responses than your typical like toy. Especially, I don't know if you guys were around like or involved when the Furby was big, but that thing blew up, and this was before virality as we know it now. But you can only interact with it with like 3 or 4 sentences, and already it was huge. So maybe it's not a mental health play. It's just a toy that allows you to interact a lot more deeper. But then how do you limit that? There's a lot of stuff that goes behind it. I just think the mental health aspect of it for me is more niche and less less duplicable by competitors. So a bit of a moat there if you have a good mental health related model. But yeah, could go either way.
Yeah, one thing I ran a mental health startup on this as a side kind of part-time thing for a couple of years. We closed up 6 months ago or so. It's called Therapata, but we use therapists from like offshore places like India because they were cheaper. But I would do some of the customer development myself and speak to some of the folks, and we were targeting this lower price point. And there's a ton of people, like if we couldn't serve them profitably, but there's a lot of people that need constant mental health, like discussion. And I think it's a great idea to take it off a computer or a screen and put it in something they can just talk to. Because I was kind of, before I put them in touch with a therapist, and I would chat with them a bit, and I could just tell, like you can read some of these people. They just needed someone to talk to. So I think even if you were to position this more as a mental health rather than, like the more like companion, I think that's almost more like a toy, like it's a pretty different space, at least in my mind. Whereas like if you position this as mental health, there's also a pretty interesting segment there. So yeah, you can go either way in my view.
Ken, you have a smaller kid, like regardless of mental health or not, suppose that you had like one of these plushies with a nice LLM built out, which means that he can talk to the plushie about how he's feeling, or you could ask it a question broadly within certain parameters. Would you just want to pick it up? What would be your thoughts around that?
I think it depends on your kid. So we have, I don't forget what it's called, like Google Home or whatever it's called, but it's got some Google AI inside, and he asks it questions and it responds, and he asks it to play music. So he's got this already, but it's not in the form of a doll or something. So he doesn't like try to chat with it like on a companion. So maybe it really is just positioning it as a doll, and then it'll, like, I have a feeling my kid wouldn't do that too much. So I think it depends a bit on the kid, right? But I'd like, would some kids do that? For sure. And I think some kid, like my kid has a lot of friends. He has no problem like meeting people, but I'm sure that there's some kids where like, you know, they're like the kid left out at school and like they need that even more.
I think a lot of kids play with imaginary friends and they kind of bring life to their dolls. I think, you know, I don't know per se, I can't remember how my sister was when I was young, but you see movies where like kids are playing on their own and talking to their dolls and having tea times and stuff. I can imagine that being elevated to like real conversations. Then are you building their social skills or are you taking away from their social skills? That's a debate for a psychologist, not for me. But definitely I see potential though.
I think so. I think I'll just close with like over the weekend, I was showing an uncle of mine like the new voice GPT. And we were talking about a very esoteric sort of like history of India in a certain part of it. And he was reading a book about that. And he started to use the voice API to ask it questions. And it truly felt like magic to him. He's like, is this like, how is this real? I think the lag currently is like 4 or 5 seconds or 3-4 seconds. So I think like it's not completely real time yet, but I think we're probably 6 months away from that. And I could just see him light up because it was like interacting with someone. Like most parents want to do it from a learning point of view, like buy this, make your kid smarter sort of like thing as well. And, you know, they'll help them along the way with modulating emotions along the way as well. Like maybe the Plushie every day would ask the question like your Whoop Band does or something like, how do you feel? Like what's happening? Record that and sort of like do that. So that could be an interesting thing. But if you could position it as this helps your kid learn faster and better. And that could be interesting too.
One thing I'll add, and I'll close with, is I met this Japanese cousin of mine last week. And when I knew him, when I last met him, it was he was 30 years ago. And I think he was like 10 years old or something. But he was this little chubby kid who would talk with himself a lot. And I loved him. Like he was so cute and funny. And the fact that he was like, talking with himself was hilarious. And then I see him 30 years later and he was working in a store. He's 40 years old and he was like proudly telling me like how he's never going to get married. And like, you know, like he just goes home and plays the video game every night. He would have loved something like this. So I think there's an audience out there in places like Japan where this is an epidemic, loneliness. And you have like guys that are just living at home 24/7. Yeah, I think there's so much that can be done in and around these lines.
Yeah, you can extend the line around like, you know, AI girlfriend, and there's those many ways you can go as well if you want to expand eventually.
This was interesting. I think like always an idea like branches out into so many ways. You can see like there's opportunity and so many people can relate to it differently. So hopefully maybe someone reaches out to Tim if they're interested in putting this together and we can take it from there. All right. I'll go next with my idea for the episode. It's along the same lines with kids. Approximately 2 weeks ago, I saw my niece preparing for one of these great exams to get into a certain type of school. And she was on her iPad and she was sort of like tapping away at this question. So I was like, hey, what app is that? So she said, it's a website. The website is called Atom Learning. And I was seeing it. It was a time test. It was sort of like imagine SATs for 11-year-olds or 10-year-olds trying to get into a school, right? And then I started looking up this company. And they raised a bunch of money, but, you know, the company does around $20 million in revenue per year at the moment, serving just this one audience. And she liked it. I spoke to the parents about it. They're paying approximately 70 pounds or something like, you know, 85 US for the app per month to help do it. the parents are not keeping this from a yearly. They bought a 3-month package that they have to prepare for it. Anyways, here's the problem I saw with it. Like most SAT prep sort of like papers that we perhaps did in the past, where we would get the books and we would do them, these people essentially took the books and turned it into an online sort of like clickable assessment. At the end of the assessment, you basically get your answers. You got this one right, this one wrong. And when you click whatever you got wrong, it would just give you the answer like, okay, this is the answer. This is how to think about it. And I noticed my niece sort of like seeing like, oh, you should look for this in the thing. And then in the next time she would do it, she would look for that thing without really understanding what she's looking for. So my idea is called AhaPrep, because I felt like all the questions, once you feed them into one of these LLMs, will create an infinite amount of questions that will never run out. And it's not so much about like preparing for time-based assessments. It is preparing for first principles thinking. Like, okay, this is the question. You click an answer and you get it wrong. A chat model comes up on the side and says, hey, why did you select answer C? And then the kid either types or talks, and then they actually go through like a tutor would, explaining to the kid why this is right or wrong. Given that, I think like we need a lot less tech and things like that, I would position this as free to get started, $30 a month. Adam Learning has something like 70,000 kids on it. To get to $1 million, I calculated you need 2,800 kids paying $30 a month for this to start making $1 million a year. And so that was my idea. And I was like, I made a note of it immediately to bring it on the pod because I saw the potential. And then parents are relatively inelastic when it comes to spending on their kids, especially for these assessments. So that's my idea, AhaPrep. Any thoughts? Ken, you have a 10-year-old as well?
So with my kid, I don't push the study too much. Like I haven't thought about it that. Like I'm not going to push him to get like a perfect SAT score or something. That's my philosophy because I was pushed. I'm not sure it was the right, My brother's daughter loves studying. Like she's like 16 and she wants to get into MIT, and she got like a 1480 the first time she took the SAT, and now she's tutoring how to take the SAT as she prepares herself to take it again, and she wants like a minimum 1550 or something. So I see the mindset in her with the students that she gets from other parents, like complete price inelasticity. She's a 16-year-old girl, and I think she makes like $80 an hour or something. And what she's doing could be totally replaced by this, what you're talking about. So yeah, I think there's the space. Obviously, she has like an endless number of clients that find her without doing any marketing, and you could just completely replace that. And I'm sure it would even, with a bit of tweaking, you do a better job.
I mean, to me, ed tech is probably the best application of using LLMs. There's no doubt about it. I use it personally to learn everything now. And if there's a better framework to do it, I'll try to figure it out. But if there's a guided one, like you mentioned, I think that's probably the smartest way to use LLMs. You mentioned, Ken, that people are paying $80 an hour for tutors. So I think your pricing has a lot of room to grow as well. At $30, I think that's so much more parents would be willing to pay if you have a proven framework to learn better. I don't know much about EdTech today, but I geeked out on Khan Academy when it came out. And I thought if I have kids or when I have kids, they're not going through traditional schooling. I want them to go through a schooling where they learn at their own pace, or they get the information at their own pace. And then the applications and the sort of exercises are done with the assistance of, at the time, a tutor. Now I think LLMs can take over that part as well. And all the social stuff about school can be done in sports or other activities. So for me, like education is super interesting. And again, I don't know much about the space, but I completely agree with your vision. I think it's definitely the way to go if you're going to use LLMs in your business. EdTech is probably the primary use for it.
Like you said, like the learning way of doing it, because like I'm also using it to learn a lot. Like these days when I'm reading a book, I have like voice API running at the back and basically just have ChatGPT open and I'm asking it questions as I'm reading as well. And the experience is so much deeper when you're doing that versus, traditionally looking something up or asking questions or making a note and coming back to it. So we have a investment in the portfolio called Synthesis, and they've really sort of like honed in on this tutor business that they do. We have around 15,000 kids into the program right now as well, running approximately like at this $30-$40 price point. And I can just see it sort of like just ramping up, because as more parents are getting exposed to this, it is just becoming huge. And so I really hope that someone actually does this, because I think it's a huge opportunity if you're interested in this space. If you can, like Ken's idea, like, someone reach out to high ranking tutors on wherever they are and they're overwhelmed with demand. We essentially go to them and say like, hey, here it is. You just push this to all the people that you can't sort of like take on full time. And we'll give you 30% of the recurring revenue as long as they're customers and stuff like that. And that way, the distribution is also just built in, because that demand is primarily there. So that's the third idea, which was about school prep using LLMs. On to the last idea of the episode, which is your second idea.
Yeah, the one that'll be the least relatable, I think, for any audience at this point. So basically, I didn't know anything about Kubernetes 2 months ago. And actually, funny enough, but using ChatGPT, I went deep into the rabbit hole about Kubernetes. And if anyone doesn't know, it's basically a way to manage servers that is more efficient than a lot of other technologies. It's something that most companies are going towards now. And the reason I got interested in Kubernetes is because I've been looking for my next startup idea for a year now since my exit. And what I was looking for was, first of all, something that was enterprise SaaS, because that's what I'm experienced with, is selling SaaS to enterprise. B2B sales is sort of my background. I wanted something enterprise level because I wanted to deal with ROI decision making. Like, I don't want to deal with emotional decision making. I want to sell, 6-figure deals that yield 10x their value, because those are much easier to sell, and you're interacting with people who are rational. I wanted something that was highly technical because I wanted a huge moat. I don't want to deal with things that anyone's going to jump on. So all of the stuff we talked about is more in that category where, if you're an aspiring founder, you want to run with this idea, and that's great. That's why we're pitching these ideas for people to run with them. But I wanted an idea that not many people could do. And I wanted something that was a growing market. And Kubernetes is growing at a 24% CAGR right now. 96% of enterprises in North America are either using it or aspire to use it in the next 10 years. Massive market. And when one of my buddies that I met 5 years ago in the Philippines came to visit me in Bangkok, and he said, hey, I've been in DevOps for 16 years. I've been running Kubernetes since they launched. I'm like top 1%. And there's this huge gap in the market where upgrading Kubernetes clusters and making sure they're secure is a super manual task, and you need super senior people to do it. If you don't do it, you're facing compliance issues, you're facing app breakage. All the operators of Kubernetes, like Amazon, Azure, etc., will auto-upgrade you after a certain amount of time because of the security issues. And we deal with this for about 90% of our clients. It's right now 40% of our revenue is manually doing all these upgrades, and it's super complicated. I started developing an app that automates all that, and it's saving 70% of our workload right now. So it's our biggest revenue driver. I want to sort of spin this off into a startup. I know you've built and sold 3 businesses. Is this something you'd be interested in taking on as a CEO and kind of building the operations and scaling the growth operations? And I was like, look, never heard that word before, but let me educate myself. And after 2 months of education, like, I've decided this is what I want to do now. So yeah, like, the idea is basically automating upgrades and securitization of Kubernetes clusters. So again, for someone who knows, they'll understand. For everyone else, they'll be like, sorry, but like, you're way beyond me. But yeah, that's the business. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kubernetes, but like, that's the trajectory.
No, I am familiar through, we have like a relatively large dev agency, and so I know that they use it on several of our enterprise sort of like customers. So that could be interesting, at least for you to maybe chat with them and see like what's happening and what they're doing. But, going back as to how you started thinking about the idea was of even greater interest to me as someone who's thinking about it, because you're a serial founder, so you've come up with a heuristic, like, this is what I'm good at, this is the market, this is the sort of moat that I want, and then you're exploring opportunities in that. And then opportunities show up when you become a little more focused into what you're looking for. And I think like that's probably like for the general audience, a really great way as to how to think about like the ideas. There were 4 ideas discussed on this podcast. And, you know, it ranged from project management to making plush toys to making education prep and now, DevOps as a thing. And you got to figure out, like, how do you think about like edge over here? Is the edge because you've done enterprise SaaS before, and so that's the edge, and then you sort of like take it from there? Because I think that's also what a lot of founders think about.
Yeah, there's an edge on both of the co-founders' side. And I think for me, co-founder is one of the sort of the pillars I focus on as well. I've gone through many different co-founders, and I've realized having someone who is both someone you've known for a long enough period of time that you trust, that you spend time outside of work, who's also an expert in their field, who has an edge in whatever they're going to do. Right now, we're both of us coming with an edge. He's like a top 1% Kubernetes developers, has managed hundreds of clients in that DevOps space. And I come with an edge of understanding how to scale rapidly a B2B business and, having remote operations, because we want to focus on North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Like, we already have aspirations for all that. So we both come with a competitive edge that is complementary, but we also have things outside of work that we are sort of mutually understanding or have a relationship outside of work as well. And that's super important to me.
I just thought I would hold on that first. If anyone takes away anything like that, was a really good way as to how to think about idea selection, about how to get started. About the idea itself, I mean, all of the investments that I've seen go into this DevOps sort of like space right now, just engineering investments of doing that, it seems to be a very, very developer-centric tooling, essentially, to assist. Because like you said, like, these engineers are expensive, like $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in the US starting, and they ramp from there. And if you can save time and hire 1 less or 2 less, like you said, like the payoff is going to be huge then.
Yeah, well, I started doing market sizing, and so I'm sure you have stuff to say as well, but like, just because you mentioned the salaries. Right now, there's roughly 17,000 companies using Kubernetes just in North America. They all need a minimum of 1 developer, relatively senior, someone, in the architecture level of things. So minimum $140K a year. They're most likely full-time or like close to full-time on that. If they run more than, let's say, 5 to 10 clusters, they need more than 1 developer. So all of a sudden you're looking, okay, they spend between $150 to $1 million a year on this, like on their platform. If you can save 50%, 80% of that, you're still looking at annual contract values in at least the middle of the 5-figure, but most likely in the 6 figures. So, getting to the 1 million AR, you need like 8, 10 clients. We looked at the market size. Just replacing those developers is around $2 billion on this current state of things. Most likely a lot higher, especially with the current CAGR, etc. So yeah, it's a really interesting market opportunity. And when I say 2 billion, like outright, it doesn't sound like a lot when you're looking at, more general public B2C sort of plays. But in the B2B space, if you have right now, there's 1 competitor and the strategy is a little different. So you're competing with 1 person for $2 billion. All of a sudden, that total addressable market is quite huge.
Are you guys thinking about this from a raise capital point of view, or do you think that you could bootstrap it?
Well, I'm speaking to investors this month, so we'll see. Like, we could definitely bootstrap it. Both, like, he's been running his shop for 16 years, so he's been, he's kind of fine in terms of capital. I've sold businesses, so I could also sustain myself. What I like about raising money, and like the investors that I'm talking to right now, they are extremely connected to the tech space in North America and Europe. Like, what we want to do is be able to be introduced to CTOs from a trust point of view and saying, hey, at least listen to these guys for 1 hour. If it makes sense, engage further. But the money is not necessarily the end point for this sort of fundraise. And I think if you can, that's usually the way you do fundraise. You don't do it just for the money. you do it because there's something else you can get from your investors, validation, introductions, partnerships, etc. And that's what we're really going after. So if we raise money, it would only be from people who really bring value and kind of understand the space and see that, these intros would weight in gold, basically.
So yeah, I still consider myself a product person. I've been in software for about 10 years and I've worked with DevOps teams. So I'm familiar with Kubernetes, and I pride myself. I think I took like a Kubernetes course on some ed tech platform for like $10. If I remember correctly, like it's also related to microservices, right? If you've got that passion for this, and like, I think having B2B sales is the skill that I see that you need. You're selling to CTOs and maybe in a smaller part to CEOs if it's a big spend and they want to reduce the DevOps spend. So if that's what you love doing and you can be passionate about the topic, I think it's great. Like everything you said about not that many people are chasing it, there's a moat, it's clear ROI. So I completely agree. I think that's all like a very good reason to be in this. It's something where I look at it, I'm like, I don't think I'd be passionate about that for a long period of time. But if you have that, then yeah, like I love it.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I look at a business, sometimes I look past the product and I look at it holistically, and I'm like, what are the playbooks? What's the, like, I look at it as the video game. I'll be honest. I've said this in a podcast before, but like business has become almost a video game, and the product that you're slinging, for lack of a better word, is just part of the game. And for me, it's like, how do you get from A to Z, and Z being sold as a business, and in between, how do you maximize your valuation? How do you sell to the right people? How do you make sure that you're selling value? Because at the end of the day, I want to be proud of what I sell, regardless of what it is. So I've become passionate about the product because I see the whole game as is.
Well, Ken brought up an interesting point. So what you just mentioned over there, Tim, like, are you saying like passion is secondary to opportunities, or are you putting market size on top when you're thinking through the thing, or like?
No, the passion is the whole thing. So basically, like, I've had a design agency, I've had an ad tech firm, I've had a fintech. I've been passionate about all of them equally, but the product was secondary in the sense that I can get on board with the product if I feel like not just the opportunity, but the game itself of building it, selling it, optimizing it, pivoting, all of that feels interesting to me, right? If I'm just saying, hey, I'm selling salary loans to employers in the Philippines, it brings them employee retention, reduces attrition, like that's okay. But like the fact that we were able to say, hey, this is a new country, we have to figure out new ways to sell to them, completely different marketing approach. All of these things combined made it exciting for me. And the same applies to Kubernetes.
So it's the passion for the game as a whole.
Exactly.
Yeah. I really like that. I think like a similar background from my side as well, having done multiple similar things. I mean, I had a advertising company back in 2008 as well. We sold to a company in the Philippines actually called Union Advertising in 2010. But yeah, it's like putting together these pieces, the right people. I think that's becoming increasingly. And I think these days it's also how to leverage all of this technology advancement. So can I talk a lot about this, like the decreasing of the number of full-time employees that you have at your company versus the amount of contractors or remote or just contractors that you have, and the amount of lift that someone can get. And I think like yesterday I was watching the NVIDIA Jensen talk about like how Elon and all those guys put together their supercomputer cluster in like 19 days as to what takes 1 year plus for someone else to do. And that was just crazy as to once you know how to play the game well, which he knows how to play really well in his space, you can just see the quantum difference between when someone who just does it for the sake of it versus someone who really knows what they're doing. Cool. Well, this was a fun episode. I liked it. It wasn't so abstract, Tim. Your last idea got us talking about a lot of different sort of like things. And I want to thank you for coming onto the show. And I hope that, I will get you back once you guys have launched and stuff like that. We can talk about Kubernetes and the game some more. But I think like there were two parts over here, Ken, that was really interesting. One was the shared belief about like schooling system and how it's failing. I would love to do a podcast where we just talk about like get one person on who is like pro school, and then one or two people on which are not so, and talk about that. And the second one about like playbooks for how founders think about like launching a business and things like that. I think those could be made into pretty interesting videos on the segment as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm much more in this camp that Tim described, where like you don't believe in the school system and you want to give your child this adaptive learning. But then when I went back to Japan, it kind of threw me. But I'm seeing all my like cousins who are younger than me by 10, 20 years. And yeah, some of them are in decent careers that are still playing by the old rules. So like, I think with some of us like in the tech world, like we're on that bleeding edge and we're like, oh yeah, like I'm going to grow my kid like this. But you forget that like, all right, there's still like this big, massive number of companies where you can have a pretty good life doing it the old way. So it'd be interesting how it evolves.
Well, thanks for having me too. Yeah, it was a really fun format. Really enjoyed it. It's the first time I do this type of format. And I think a learning for me was to sort of interact a lot more with the guests on things that are not my comfort zone. And I really like that. So yeah, thanks for that.
No, thanks for coming on. And hope everyone enjoyed the episode. If you liked it, please leave a comment below or subscribe, because we're trying to grow the channel. That would help us a lot. And until next week then.